So one thing I can do is I can put that recovery tank in a bucket of water, but by the time I do that, there's going to be very little water in there. So at first it'll work great, but it's going to heat that water up pretty quickly. Once the water becomes the same temperature as the tank, are you having heat transfer? No, you're really not. So you have to keep exchanging that water out. A blanket, a wet rag, wet rags around it with a fan actually helps, because what's happening is evaporation. For every pound of water that evaporates off that tank, it absorbs 970 BTUs of heat energy, right? And it doesn't have as much of a mess. But then you have to have a fan involved and water, and then you have, more issues and potential for electrocution and all that. So, what about? And also, there's only so much of that refrigerant touching so much of that tank. There's a lot of refrigerant, and only some of that refrigerant is touching the outside of that tank. And there's only so much of that refrigerant touching the water, right? There's only so much of the water touching the bucket on the outside. We're still having to get rid of the heat. But what about if I took that pipe, and on that pipe I ran my refrigerant into, say, a coil like this. Ideally spread out a little bit more, so there's more coil touching more water. And instead of using that big bucket, I could even use a smaller bucket. I could use a big bucket, but I could use a smaller bucket and put ice in there. Ice water in there. Now as I'm sending the refrigerant out of my machine, it first goes through this heat exchanger, and then it goes into my tank.
It's already cooled off by the time it hits the tank.
Yes, we have it cool before it even gets in the tank. And since there's a lot of metal here, there's a lot of refrigerant touching a lot of metal, and a lot of metal touching a lot of ice. Well, the very first one I made, I used 3/8 pipe, which the pipe was too big and it held too much refrigerant. So the second one I made was more like this, to where it used smaller. So it's 1/4-inch copper tubing. And our hoses are also 1/4-inch. So it's a lot of heat transfer. Put that in some 32-degree mixture, saturated mixture of 32-degree water and ice, and it won't change temperature until all that ice melts. But even once all that ice melts, it's still low temperature. It's going to take a while before it heats it all the way up. So this way, before the refrigerant ever gets into my tank, it's cool. It's a lot cooler. So nowadays, what's great is you can buy these already pre-made.
And then you stick that in the bucket of ice?
Yes, you put this in a bucket of ice. It's got a little handle on it, has where water can come through, and really it's just a coil of copper all coiled up. There's a lot of copper in here, and it's spaced out. I'm going to pass it around, you can see how it's spaced out. And what it's designed to do is the refrigerant touches the copper touches the ice water, but rejects heat. We cool the refrigerant off before it ever gets into the tank. By keeping the temperature of that refrigerant lower, what happens to the pressure in the tank? It stays lower. How does that affect the compression ratio of my recovery machine? Recover faster. And ultimately, that's the big goal. Recover faster. So this one, it's really a subcooler is what it is. But they had this particular brand. They have a name for it. It's the Molecular Transformator. What? Patent pending.
Your patent?
Oh, if it was my patent, I'd be doing this video from a beach somewhere in Australia. Molecular Transformator, just a big word for it keeps the refrigerant cool, keeps it into a subcools that liquid so that we keep the tank cool. The subcooler, that's all it's doing. It's dropping the temperature of the refrigerant below saturation, getting rid of that heat.
So if that's the name for that specific brand, what would be like the general term, just like there's
Subcooler. So I'll pass it around, you can see it. Now, I didn't bring the first ones I made, I just kind of reenacted it for you. But this one, what I had was people keep messing with it, but I had it spread out like a spring. And then all I did was braze on each end ports for my gauges to go on. And then as I'm sending the refrigerant through here, cool it off.
I just looked at that.
I'm not a supply house, I don't know.
I just looked. TrueTech has it for like.
I did, a long time ago. I've had that for about 10 years now.
Do you use it constantly when you were?
No, I teach now, so when I was
When you
working.
were working.
Every time I was doing recovery.
It speeds it up that much.
Absolutely.
plus it makes the tank not heat up.
Even if I have to use, even if I don't have ice with me and I'm using water, it's just there's a lot of metal touching a lot of the water, and yep.
would that still work without any water or anything around it? And if you just
Well, it would still probably help because you're moving air through it and there's still a lot of air touching a lot, but you're not going to get the same
is
effect.
there any disadvantage to using that in a system when you're recovering?
The disadvantage is there's going to be refrigerant still in there, inside of that, and sometimes what you'll have to do is you'll take your low loss fitting off of everything, and then you have to also hook your recovery. After you're done with the unit, you may have to hook that up to your recovery machine to pull the last little bit of refrigerant out of that to force it into the tank. I mean, no, because the idea is that you already have this going. You can take your stuff loose. You can set that up, but it can be doing that while you're now doing your work. So it's not a big loss, but some people complain about that. Well, I got to take my gauges off. I got to hook it up to that and pull the refrigerant out of that. Well, that's really not that much time.
You throw a handful of rock salt in there?
Why?
So it'll freeze.
You don't want it to freeze.
It will freeze, but it'll get colder. Rock salt.
I think you're in a different. Yeah, you're in a different science. That's a whole day's class.
Ice and freezing water bottom.
Yeah, no, there's. We're not going to cover that because that's a whole other. When we get into this, if we had time to cover the science, I could spend all day on just that and how we make ice cream, and the temperature difference, and heat exchange, and freezing point, and all that.
Just the internal diameter of our hoses.
Yeah, definitely. They'll be like, look.
Nice.
It's just good for 2 minutes.
$200 on it.
There you go.
Took me a while though. Couldn't get it. Okay. So cool with hose
I
stuff.
feel like I should be passing a current through this being putting some metal in it.
To heat it up.
Yeah, inductive heating.
All right. So questions about cooling that refrigerant off before it goes to the tank? Okay. So we covered cords and we covered subcooler. Right, so the scale, the refrigerant scale. Whoops. I think this one that we brought in has bad batteries. Yep, batteries are dead. Oh, there it goes. That's on. So refrigerant scale, so many pounds, so many ounces. What I want to do is before I do anything, get my tank set up on here. And I want to hit that tare button or the 0 button so that way I can know exactly how much refrigerant that I'm putting into that tank. I want to know how much I took out of that system. You'd be surprised how many units are overcharged with refrigerant. So you want to know how much you're taking out. And so when you're putting it back in, you know you don't put too much in as well. So I always want to measure how much refrigerant I took out, how much refrigerant I put back in. That make sense? So far, so good? Okay, so next we're going to talk about our recovery tanks. All right, so on recovery tanks. So we got our 2 valves. One of them has a straw that goes down to the center. But on our recovery tanks, there's some information in these tanks that are very, very, very important. Some information that we're going to need when we're working with this. Some of that information we're going to look for is a TW and a WC. TW and a WC. TW stands for, anybody know?
Total weight?
Tare weight. It's tare weight. What do I do with this scale? When I put a tank on here, what do I do to this scale?
Tear it.
I tear it. I zero it out. Other than subtracting the weight that's on there. So when it says tare weight, that really translates to something that's a little easier for us to remember, which is simply tank weight. The weight of the tank itself. Empty. Nothing in it. Just the weight of the tank. The metal that makes up the tank. It's really tank weight. Now the professional word for it is tare weight. That's what the letters really stand for, is tare weight. But it's simpler to remember it as tank weight. Or to help you put them all together, tank tare weight. Right? Tank tare weight. And then we also have WC. Anybody know what WC stands for? Water capacity. TW stands for tare weight, and WC stands for water capacity. It's how many pounds of water that tank will hold full. How many pounds of water? Now, we never want to overfill one, but it's how many pounds of water that tank will hold. Right? Tare weight, which is tank weight, and WC is water capacity. There's still a few more numbers we're going to learn. Those are the two we're going to notice right now. So TW stands for what? Tare weight. WC stands for what? Water capacity. Good. So what we're going to do next, we're going to go to the lab. We're going to go through those tanks, and we're going to find those numbers on multiple different tanks. All right? Let's go do that.